اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear beloved students and friends and ulama, I hope and pray inshallah you are well. We are now on the section of ala wajhin mufid. We just completed the discussion last week on what mal is, the difference between something which is mal and something which is not mal. That can be reviewed in the previous discussions. Now we are beginning to move towards the idea of a contract, because what was presented by Imam Huskafi rahimahullah anhu was, what is the subject matter of a transaction? That's what was presented earlier. That's the key. In bay', the asal and the core is the mabir. That is the core of everything. And that has to be mal and that has to be mutaqawwim. If the mabir is not mal, it's not mutaqawwim, no transaction can ever be valid. It will not be a bay' from a Sharia perspective. And therefore, he introduced a core, the key element, the thing upon which transactions are made and developed. And the reason why markets come together, it's for these goods, these items, or these commodities, because that is what gives benefit. Money is just a means towards acquiring something beneficial, but mal is that which benefits. Therefore, the discussion commenced with mal, the idea of goods being of benefit to people, as that is the entire objective of exchange in Sharia. The entire objective of exchange is to transfer value, where one party is ready to forego an item they have for something of value which you have, which may be money, or it could be another item. But I'm ready to forego what I have for what you have. And therefore, we see that this trade-off is beneficial. So, from a mu'amalat perspective, every transaction is a win-win. And from a Sharia perspective, any transaction which creates a win-loss, where one party wins at the expense of the other, at the stake of another, then such a transaction very likely will be non-compliant, it will be fasid, it could even be batil, depending what the transaction is. From a Sharia perspective, all transactions result and must result in both parties gaining something from the bargain. Now, whether the item is beneficial in the long term or short term, or whether it's something which is durable or not durable, or whether it breaks down or not, that's a secondary issue. But both parties receive something tangible, which the markets have a value for. Economically, it's valuable. Both parties are gaining something which is considered to be mal and mutaqawwim. That's a win from a Sharia perspective. And that's the end of the transaction there. Now, whatever happens thereafter, it doesn't mean if the item was to break 1 hour later, it doesn't mean that this was a win-loss. It just means that the item, it so happened perchance that the item was destroyed. It wasn't in the qadr of this individual or something. He must have made a mistake, an error, he dropped it, or it broke one way or the other, and therefore he's lost the item. But the transaction itself enabled an exchange of value. Right? That's what we were discussing. And so we have discussed the entire concept of mal and the subject matter. And now we move on to this idea of ala wajhin mufidin makhsus, which we also touched upon briefly, that the transaction must have a beneficial outcome. It must be done in a manner, in a way. So there's two things being mentioned here. One is it must be mufid, that the transaction, the contract, it must result in something sensible, something reasonable. It must be something which is of benefit to the parties. And it's sensible, it's logical, it's rational, it's reasonable. And then number two, it is makhsus in a manner that there's a process, a due process for any transaction, for any contract to be executed in Sharia. A contract has particular pillars. Until those pillars are not met, there will be no contract. So the book is saying that there's two things. One is it must be reasonable. It must be something which is of reasonable benefit to both parties. In other places of fiqh, for example, in the chapter of ijara and leasing, some fuqaha discuss the idea of when somebody leases their clothing or an item for a use which is weird, odd, unnatural. So, for example, if I leased clothing to you so that you may hang on the front door, as an example, which has no benefit whatsoever, right? There's no need for it. It's not playing any role. It's not serving any purpose. The fuqaha have mentioned that such a lease will be fasid because there is no manfa'a maqsuda. They mention this exact terminology, that leasing should result in manafi' maqsuda, that there must be some purposeful activity as a result of the lease, something which is of benefit, something which has a motive, a valid purpose, a reasonable intent for lease. And so when something is unreasonable, then it's not valid. And in the same discussion, this is actually mentioned by Ali Haydar in his Durr al-Hukam, his Sharh al-Majallat al-Ahkam. He's discussed this in the chapter of Ijara. And he mentions two things. One is fi nadri shara' wa fi nadri al-uqala. That not what we're looking at is from a Sharia perspective, is it okay? But also from the uqala perspective. The people, rationally, reasonably, do people consider this to be acceptable? Right? Do sound people consider this activity to be reasonable or not? And that's also a measure or a yardstick to determine whether a transaction is reasonable. Right? So up here, he's saying ala wajhin mufidin, right, which we just discussed. Makhsus, it has a process, the terms, the conditions, the contract, phraseology, formation, whether it's documented, whether it's not documented, it's all oral, it's or it's written form, whichever format, the format and the process, the diligence must be done properly. It says A bi ijabin or ta'atin. There must be some kind of meeting of the mind, some kind of offer and acceptance, which will be discussed shortly. Then he says from here, فَخَرَجَ التَّبَرُّعُ مِنَ الْجَانِبَيْنِ. He mentioned that because he's mentioned ala wajhin mufid, makhsus, this particular way and this idea of mubadara shay'in marghubin fihi bimithlihi, that definition of a bay and this idea of makhsus, it makes tabarru' min al-janibayn excluded from this. What is tabarru' min al-janibayn? Tabarru' min al-janibayn refers to a scenario where there's two parties, they are gifting each other a gift, a donation, an item, a contribution, and it's both parties, in that sense, is bilateral. Both parties are giving something. It's not unilateral performance, but it's both parties giving something independent of the other, right? So each performance, each donation is independent, and its execution is not connected contractually with the transaction of the other party. What does that mean? It means that when I'm giving you a gift, I'm not saying to you in the contract, I'm giving you this gift in lieu of or in exchange of what you're giving me. Rather, I'm giving you this gift, and then you turn around and say to me, oh, I'm giving you this gift, where there's no connection, even though it's subsequent, even though any person will look at it and they'll say, chronologically, this second gift is a result of the first gift. That may be right in terms of chronology and in terms of sequencing, but contractually, in terms of the contract, there's no connection contractually between the first and the second donation. And from a fiqh perspective, the sabab of the second donation or the second gift is not the first contract. The sabab of the second donation is not within the first contract. Rather, both donations are initiated because of two different causes, two different sabab. The first donation was because I wanted to give you a gift. The second donation was because you wanted to give me a gift. You were not compelled contractually to now gift something back to me because I've gifted something to you. This is what Tabarru min al-Janibayn means, where there's two parties which are both now extending gifts to one another. However, the cause is not that because I've given you a gift, contractually you are now obliged to give a gift back to me. It's not that. And in terms of the Arabic language, like how do you differentiate? So the fuqaha talk about the phraseology in Arabic, and they mention that whenever the letter ba is mentioned, right, then that means a bay and a mubadala. So in this example up here, mubadalatu shay'in marghubin fihi bimithlihi, right? This idea here, that is bimithlihi. That's a bay, because when ba is used, it's used in for mubadala, that I'm giving you this in lieu of or in exchange of this particular item. However, when tabarru comes, there's no such phraseology like that, right? There's no such phraseology where I'm giving you this in lieu of this. That's what makes the tabarru min al-Janibayn different to a mubadala, where the tabarru min al-Janibayn has no such contractual connection between the two performances or the two donations or the two grants and gifts from either party. Each donation is independent in that the cause of the donation is because the donor himself wanted to give you this. He was not compelled by a contract which was agreed to with the other party. So that's what tabarru min al-Janibayn means. This concept is applied today in Islamic finance, especially in Takaful, which is the alternative to Islamic insurance. In Islamic insurance or Takaful, what happens is the parties, they pool their funds together. There's many models used for this. There's a wakala model, there's a mudaraba model, there's a waqf model, there's a hybrid between wakala and mudaraba, there's a hybrid between waqf and wakala. There's many different models out there that are used. Waqf is one of the easy models to adapt and adopt and use, although it's not prevalent in the UK. But how it works is, if we take that as a case study, the donors, so those who want to be insured, the policyholders, they will contribute the premium, right? So they're still paying premiums. They'll contribute and make a donation to a fund, to a company, and they'll transfer the funds in the bank account. Now that's a waqf. When they donate it to the waqf now has its own charter, right? Its own kind of constitution. The waqf constitution will say, whoever donates to us, we will cover them and give them some kind of indemnity. We will ensure that they are covered from certain risks that they may face. So in this example, the donor gave from his own accord, and the waqf is helping and giving something back to the donor not because contractually there was something in a donation or contribution agreement, right, in the policyholders agreement. Rather, it was due to the Waqf constitution, the Waqf charter, the Waqf deed, that in there it was written and mentioned that whoever gives will be covered or will benefit from some protection. And the sabab, the cause of the covering of any claims will be a result of this. This will be the initiator of any payments being paid out to policyholders. Not that the contributors, the donors who are giving a contribution amount, the policyholders, it's not that in their contract it's mentioned that because you are giving £100 per annum as a premium, you are now being insured up to £1,000. It's not that. So there's no contractual obligation in the policyholder document that they sign in the contribution document. Rather, the obligation is initiating from a different sabab. There's two causes here. The obligation to cover the insured with claims and payments, it's because of the Waqf document, right? So that's how that operates. So you see this in practice. This idea of Tabarru min al-Janibain is used in practice. And especially in the entire Takaful model, that's how it's operating. Because if that's not the case, the moment Takaful was to become a mu'awada between the policyholder and the insurance company or the Takaful company, then it would become more or less very similar to conventional insurance. That is one of the greatest arguments against conventional insurance from a fiqh perspective, which is that why, as a policyholder, are you paying for something where the return is uncertain, unexpected, unknown? Peace of mind is not a return. Even though you may be getting peace of mind, but from a legal fiqh perspective, a technical perspective, that is not considered to be a valid exchange of value. It's not considered to be a good, an item which you can buy, because the peace of mind is not given to you by the counterparty. It's something which you yourself feel. He doesn't input anything into your mind. He doesn't inject anything into your mind. It's you yourself feeling this. So then there's nothing really transferred from the counterparty to you. Rather, you're feeling a new emotion. That peace of mind emotion can be attributed to many things. It's not necessarily just a transaction that you've made. That may play a part. It may make you feel good, but it can be anything for that matter. So an insurance contract, an insurance transaction, because you as a premium payer or policyholder, you've made a payment. The insurance company now promises you to cover certain damages, certain expenses, claims that you may have in lieu of your premium that you've paid. Now, that is uncertain. You don't know whether they'll pay, whether they'll not pay, something will happen, something will not happen. Sharia does not allow any scenario or situation where one party makes a certain payment and the other party, their side of the bargain is uncertain. They have to be delivering, they have to be giving. Because what can happen, and this is what happens in many instances, a person pays for 10, 15 years premiums. He never claims on his insurance, right? And so you continuously keep paying. You've never had to claim on your insurance, but you've paid for 15 years. And now that can amount to like 20, 30,000 pounds. Whereas you could have used those funds elsewhere. So it's not been of any benefit to you. The other side has benefited completely from your premiums. And so such a setup whereby one party continuously drains the resources of another party, it's not Sharia compliant. This is the objection and concern with insurance contracts. And because there's a lack of those who say there's a lack of exchange, or there's an exchange but there's nothing that's paid back to you, then it's just a transaction where one party is paying for the other party's party being potentially ready to pay something. If money is paid, some scholar then it's a matter of riba because you're receiving more or less. That's another issue. And some ulama further go on to say that this creates a gambling setup whereby one party is winning at the expense of another. You're either losing all your funds or you're gaining more in return from the insurance company. So it's like one party is losing at the expense of the other, which is a gambling setup and arrangement. So this is Tabarru min al-Janibain. We discussed how this is now used in Takaful, which is the alternative to insurance. Then he mentions Hiba bi shart al-iwadi. Hiba bi shart al-iwad is another example which is different from mubadala. It's not a mu'awada. For all intents and purposes, it's not a mu'awada. What do we mean by that? Al-hiba bi shart al-iwad, the Hanafi fuqaha are unique in the way they analyze this. And the Hanafi fuqaha are, mashallah, very intricate in the analysis. The mudaraba transaction is an example of their intricate analysis, whereby they have 5-6 different phases when it comes to analyzing a mudaraba. So first they'll say it's a wadi'a, then they'll say if it becomes fasid, it becomes an ijara. If all the profits are conditioned for the mudarib, it becomes a qard, a loan. If it becomes all the profits are conditioned for the investor, the Rabbul Mal, it becomes what's known as bada'a, ibda', and that's another type of contract. If there is a profit share, only then it becomes mudaraba. If both parties commingle their assets, it becomes a musharaka. So they mention these different transformations of the contract. That its mudaraba goes through several phases, depending on what's actually happening. And that's why it's very important whenever you're researching, looking at a contract, a document, a structure, a product, all the facts have to be in front of you to understand how the contract is being impacted, because the terms and conditions can morph the concept into something else. So although on paper it's written as a mudaraba, right? That's the heading of the contract, but because there's a clause in that contract which states that the profits will primarily be for the mudarib only, right? And the Rabbul Mal will get profits after 3 years, 4 years. That means that the funds are a loan initially, and therefore the entire contract has changed, because now all the capital that was given, the risk is borne by the mudarib, and the profits are also for him. So therefore the entire nature of the transaction has changed. So it's important to analyze the terms, the clauses, terms and conditions in depth and thoroughly to understand if the form that's being portrayed by the contract matches the concept being advertised by the product. So al-hiba bi shart al-iwad, what makes it so unique? Hiba bi shart al-iwad, the fuqaha mentioned ibtida'an, initially at the outset it's a hiba. Intiha'an, at the end it becomes a bay'. So the fuqaha sometimes when they analyze something, they look at it in terms of outcomes and consequences. Like the mudaraba example. They're looking at what's the outcomes. What are the changes, the tweaks that are being made that's changing the nature. Another way fuqaha analyze transactions and contracts is in terms of timing and in terms of performances. That ibtida'an, at the outset, we can consider this to be a hiba. However, at the end, when the second or when the iwad is given, we will consider it to be a bay', and all the laws of bay' apply. Whereas at the outset, the laws of hiba apply. So the fuqaha, based on time preference and sequencing, they've given a different ruling to the same transaction almost. It's the same kind of like activity that's taking place, but they've analyzed it differently from 2 different angles in terms of time. Right? So that's another way fuqaha analyze a transaction. Now, what makes it different? What makes al-hiba bi shart al-iwadi different from a mu'awada? Mu'awada is your exchange. Hiba bi shart al-iwad, the difference is that the phraseology from an Arabic perspective is that the harf jar ala will be used instead of ba. So instead of saying I'm buying this bimithlihi, like using the letter ba in Arabic language, you're saying ala mithlihi. So ala gives the kind of condition idea that this is being given to you on condition you give this to me. That's why bi shart al-iwadi. It's bi shart al-iwad. So it's like the shart of iwad is in lieu, that's in lieu of the hiba. And the shart has ala because shurut come with ala. So the hiba is given in lieu of a shart, a ala al-iwadi. That's what this text really means. And so even in the English language, whatever language is used to give the impression of a muawada, a mubadala, an exchange, that will always be for a sale. And whenever whichever language is used from a legal perspective to give the idea of conditionality, on condition, this is a typical wording that's used, on condition X, or you warrant, represent that you will do ABC if this is done, right? These are different terminologies and the way contracts are laid out. In that instance, that will be al-hiba bi shart al-iwad. What happens in terms of the mechanics of hiba bi shart al-iwad, that there is no exchange of milkiya immediately. Because remember, the entire idea of a bay is the moment ijab and qabul is done, the offer and acceptance, even though you may not take, you may not grasp the item in front of you immediately upon offer and acceptance. But the moment you do ijab and qabul, you do offer and acceptance, the ownership of the item is transferred to you. And the funds which are due, it becomes a claim. Now, the seller, he has a claim upon you for those items, or for the funds, right? The amount that you're going to pay. And so it transfers in terms of milkiya. Yeah, there's another idea of qabd and risk transferring, but ownership is transferred. Milkiya is transferred, risk is transferred with qabd. However, when it comes to al-hiba bi shart al-iwad, hiba is only completed when qabd takes place. Meaning, by me just saying to you that I give you this gift, it's not sufficient. Yes, if a father is gifting something to a small child, that is sufficient, because the father's qabd and possession, it suffices for the possession of the child. Right? The father is a representative of the child, and he does not need to hand over something physically to the child. His mere utterance is enough to execute a donation to one's child, right? A son or daughter, it doesn't matter. However, when it's strangers transacting, you have to deliver the item into the possession, physical or constructive, whether they physically take possession or constructively, whereby you deliver the item in a safe space owned by this person, or in any zone which they've allocated for you to deliver, or any space that they've allocated that deliver the item here. That will be considered to be qabd for the party. So in a hiba, you have to deliver the item to the opposite party for the donation or for the hiba to be complete. If it's not, then there is no donation, there is no hiba. So here, until hiba is not done, the counterparty does not become the owner. So the qabd has to take place in the majlis, in the contracting session, for this hiba to be accepted on the very terms that you have discussed with the person, which is bi shart al-iwadi, right? So before taqabud, before you give something back to me, I've given a gift to yourself. If you don't give something back in lieu of this item, I still have the right from a fiqh perspective to do ruju', to redeem the item. I can take it back from you. From a fiqh, because although there's some discussion on this, whether you need to go to court, what you need to do. There is a discussion, we will read that in Kitab al-Hiba, but there is a potential clawback possibility where I can recover the item from yourself and redeem it. But once you have now given an item, you fulfill the shart al-iwad, you give something back to me in lieu of what I've given to you on the very terms that we discussed, then no longer can I take it back, because now this hiba bi shart al-iwad is in the ruling of bay. Whenever you've given something now in lieu of this on the very terms that we had agreed, it becomes in the ruling of bay, where there's two parties, both of them have received something as a result of the initial contract, and now it's solidified as a bay. All the rulings of a bay will be considered. However, one point I just want to note here is that this will only apply when the iwad is ma'loom, the iwad is known. If the iwad is unknown, it will remain tabarru' min al-janibayn. It will not become a bay intiha'an. It will remain tabarru' min al-janibayn. That's one of the key points to remember. I've written an entire article on convertible notes. Convertible notes are an instrument which startups use to raise funding for their projects and their startup companies, right? They use convertible notes. Typically, from a conventional perspective, it's based on interest. What happens is a loan is made. The lenders, which are the kind of like note holders, they don't receive anything in the interim in terms of like payouts or payments of interest to their account. Rather, the interest accrues on account, whereby with the company they have their kind of like, you could say, account, and the interest is accruing, and this loan with the interest converts into equity on another round. So when there's a Series A fundraise, as an example, the convertible note will be converted into shares with a discount, into equity with a discount plus interest. Now that's in the favor, that's why they invest in this particular manner. So I've written an article on the Amana Advisors website. You can just Google this actually, convertible notes, on how to structure a convertible note in a Sharia compliant way. In there, I've discussed in depth the different potential models and Sharia compliant alternatives on how to do this. And I've discussed this very same structure, al-hiba bi shart al-iwad. I've proposed a structure using the concept of al-hiba bi shart al-iwad al-majhul, right? Which is then becomes a tabarru' min al-janibayn. So any person who's interested in reading that can read the article there and the analysis there. This idea of tabarru' min al-janibayn, hiba bi shart al-iwad, and this whole idea of mu'awada versus tabarru'. Mu'awada being this exchange, tabarru' being a one-sided, a unilateral performance. It's very, very important for today's Islamic finance industry. Very important. It's at the heart. It's almost in every single transaction. Why is that the case? In Islamic finance today, there's multiple transactions taking place because they're financing contracts, as we discussed. They're not trades per se in the way trades were done classically. The entire objective is to finance assets. And so there's always a financier, a customer, and a vendor, a seller who has assets, typically speaking. And so the bank doesn't want to hold on to the assets, or the financing company doesn't want to hold on to the assets. All it wants to do is it wants to finance, and it wants to get rid of the assets off his books and transfer it eventually to the customer. And the customer wants to own the assets. It doesn't want to have a liability continuously to a financer. So how do we ensure this happens eventually? How do we ensure that the bank, Islamic bank, is not left with 100 properties on its balance sheet, or it's left with, if it's car financing of 10,000 cars which depreciate in value severely, leaving the bank with no assets, or economically there's no benefit whatsoever, and the balance sheet has really been impacted by depreciation. So what happens is the concept of wa'd is used. The concept of undertaking. Wa'd is a promise. And in most contracts, promises will be used to ensure that should the client or customer fail to buy this particular thing, they will because they've made a wa'd, they've taken an undertaking, or they've promised to do something. Based on that promise, they will execute, or they will perform, and they will adhere and oblige to the transaction which they committed to, or commit to a particular performance. So for example, the undertaking will say, I promise I will buy this item. Sometimes the amount is mentioned, it's not mentioned, a formula is mentioned, a date may be mentioned, a date may not be mentioned, a particular interval may be mentioned, but there's a promise. So he's imposing upon himself the promise to do something in future. So promises are used in Islamic finance. Now there's a debate. These wa'ad and promises which are used, what's the Sharia status of this? So from the fuqaha, earlier fuqaha, the fuqaha, majority of the fuqaha were of the view that, the classical fuqaha and the madhabs were of the view that mawa'id, promises, are diyanatan necessary, but not qada'an. Meaning, in qada, when you take it to court, it cannot be enforced. But diyanatan, morally, it's binding. You have to fulfill this. You'll be sinful for not complying with your promise. There were some ulama, tabi'in, fuqaha, scholars, even sahaba, Sayyidina Samura radiallahu an, al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala, Ishaq ibn Rahway rahimahullah ta'ala, they were of the view that it's qada'an and diyanatan binding. Ibn Nujaym rahimahullah, the great Hanafi scholar, he mentions that qada'an, it will be binding if it's conditional. And then there's an entire principle that's mentioned in the books of fiqh, that al-mawa'id قد تكون لازمة عند حاجة الناس, that mawa'id can become binding if there's a need for it. In recent times, the OIC Fiqh Academy, they ruled that a wa'ad, a promise, can be qada'an binding from a Sharia perspective as well, not only diyanatan, morally, but also qada'an, it can be binding if the promisee, the one who was given the promise to, right? So in our example, it would be a bank, Islamic bank or financer, because they're the promisee. The promisor is the one giving the promise, the customer typically. It'll be enforceable if the promisee incurred damages. Okay. Then Ayofi came. Ayofi were the view, no, qada'an is also enforceable. That is also a view from the fuqaha and from the ulama. And therefore, qada'an will also be enforceable. And now that's the kind of view that's taken across the board, that qada'an, it will also be enforceable. However, that's in terms of fiqh, but the issue arises in English law. How do you make it binding? Because English law has many similarities to Sharia, that if you don't give consideration in a contract in English law, that contract is not enforceable. It's purely a donation. Right? You can't enforce something. So if I give a promise to give something, but you do not promise anything in return of that, then that performance of that contract is not binding, it's not enforceable. So how do we make a wa'ad, an undertaking, enforceable in English law? Then there's certain formats, or there's certain structures in English law which can be used to make an agreement, an undertaking, enforceable even if it does not have consideration. So even if it's like a tabarru, it can be enforced in court, and this is known as a deed. When you execute an undertaking as a deed, then it's what's known as a contract under seal. A contract under seal is enforceable in English courts, and therefore there's no consideration that's needed. Just the undertaking itself will be sufficient, and that's how typically most wa'ads are executed now in Islamic finance structures and different products, that they are structured as deeds. The undertaking, the wa'ad, is a deed, it's a contract under seal, and therefore it will be enforceable. It's enforceable qada'an from a Sharia perspective. You have to oblige morally, diyanatan. Qada'an, you have to oblige also from an Islamic legal perspective in the courts, and also from an English law perspective, where these contracts are often debated and raised if there's a dispute, that even from that perspective, they'll say, no, because the form was correct, which was it was in a deed, it will be enforced, right? So inshallah, we'll end here. Next week we'll continue this whole idea وَخَرَجَ بِمُفِيدٍ مَا لَا يُفِيدٍ, the entire discussion of why mufid was mentioned. We'll continue with that next week inshallah. جزاك الله خير. سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك.